Hello, your friendly neighborhood host JT Wheatley here again, back for another episode of the History of Comics podcast, this time with the history of Image Comics. For decades, Marvel and DC have dominated the American comic book market. Originally, it was DC whose publishing of Superman and Batman in the late 1930s ushered in the golden age of comic books, and they even brought about the Silver Age with the creation of Barry Allen Flash in the late 1950s. However, DC was quickly overtaken by Marvel in the 1960s, who created new, innovative characters with Spider-Man, the Hulk, and the X-Men. Since then, the two companies have been rivals ever since, with few other comic book companies providing a challenge. However, one company would finally do so in the 1990s, and it would be so by not only using their own artists against Marvel and DC, but actually putting them in charge of their own creations. It all started when Tom DeFalco, the editor-in-chief at Marvel, replaced Jim Shooter in 1987. Shooter was a popular but controversial editor-in-chief, ushering Marvel through one of its most successful eras, covering such classic events as the Dark Phoenix saga and the X-Men, and Secret Wars, which he wrote. Despite decades of dominance in Shooter's leadership, the 1980s, particularly 1986, which ironically represented the 25th anniversary of the Fantastic Four #1, the comic that launched the modern Marvel, had seen DC steal the spotlight again, not only with the celebration of its own 50th anniversary, but also producing such classic comics like The Dark Knight Returns, The Watchmen, and Crisis of Infinite Earths. While the House of Ideas was still producing strong sales with comics like Uncanny X-Men, DC was getting all the attention, and DeFalco felt Marvel needed an injection of new talent. There was also outside pressure as well, as Marvel would be purchased by investor Ronald Perlman, notable for owning the Revlon, which got him the nickname at Marvel, the Lipstick Guy, in 1989, with the intention of taking Marvel public. Thus, the comic book company needed to make a name for itself and brought on some new artists to do just that. Of this new talent, some notable ones was Eric Larson, Rob Liefeld, Jim Lee, Todd McFarlane, Walsh Patachio, Mark Silvestri, and Jim Valentino. The new artists quickly broke from the mold of penciling and set by John Romita Sr., John Buscema, Jack Kirby, and Steve Ditko, choosing instead to create highly detailed panels and characters with ripped superheroes and villains. However, many would later note these artists did this to the detriment of storytelling, the primary job of any comic book artist. The look became popular with readers, though, and others soon followed, such as Larry Stroman and Dale Keown. As sales rose, they were assigned to Marvel's premier books, such as Amazing Spider-Man, which Todd McFarlane and Eric Larson would tackle, and The Uncanny X-Men by Jim Lee and Walsh Patachio. Soon, these artists were so popular, the books were created just for them to run, such as Spider-Man, which Todd McFarlane wrote and penciled, and The X-Men for Jim Lee, along with X-Force, which was originally New Mutants under Rob Liefeld. When these new comic books debuted, they ended up being huge sellers, with Spider-Man #1 selling 2.5 million copies, X-Force #1 selling 5 million copies, and X-Men #1 selling a staggering 8 million. Though all three used gimmick covers to enhance sales, from collectible trading cards to variant covers. Marvel was selling like never before in the 1990s, and with 80 titles being published a month, making the company the top publisher of the American comic book industry once again. They also started to promote these artists like stars, to the point where Rob Liefeld started a Levi's jeans commercial directed by Spike Lee. However, the same artists responsible for that success quickly became upset with Marvel over money it was making on their art, such as selling it on t-shirts without their permission, and started to want a larger share of the profits. Some of the new artists that had already banded together for artistic reasons, forming Hamad Studios, which consisted of Jim Lee, Walsh Patachio as pencilers, with Scott Williams as inker, located in San Diego, California. The name was meant to represent honoring the past artists like Neil Adams, who they greatly admired, and the first book they produced was Marvel's Uncanny X-Men #267. Mark Silvestri would later join, giving the studio 3 pencilers and 1 inker in Scott Williams. The artists not only worked together, but started talking about working for Marvel and their frustrations. It wasn't huge at first, no more than normal work there, but the cracks of the break from Marvel was starting to form. The first signs of this break occurred when Todd McFarlane retired, leaving Eric Larson to take over his Spider-Man title with issue number 16. Much of his frustration came from Tom DeFalco objecting to letting a sword stab Juggernaut in the eye as part of an X-Force crossover with Rob Liefeld's comic, claiming it violated the Comics Code Authority (CCA) standards, though McFarlane countered that numerous other examples of violence already permeated much of Marvel's books. By this point, the CCA had lost much of its effectiveness and its rules were kind of iffy. There were also personal reasons, as McFarlane and his wife Wanda just had their first child, and he chose to take a break, having put away enough money for just such an occasion. The next sign of the break came when Rob Liefeld tried to create The Executioners at Malibu, but was reined in by Marvel, who claimed it was too similar to his work in the X-Force. It didn't help that The Executioners' name really emphasized the X in the title. David Olbrich, the head of Malibu, had seen the original proposal for Youngblood, a comic idea Rob Liefeld first created back in 1987, but Liefeld chose instead to do Hawk and Dove at DC. Malibu Comics was an up-and-coming comic book company founded in 1986, noted for being creator-friendly, and Liefeld always had an open invitation to make anything he wanted there, which he remembered. Olbrich did advertise the extreme art of Rob Liefeld, along with establishing not only a relationship with him, but also Erik Larsen and Jim Valentino, offering all three the chance to publish anything they wanted to under Malibu, which they would also get to own. The original idea was to continue working at Marvel while also doing creator-owned work at Malibu, and Erik Larsen was the first to jump at the chance, with Valentino following soon afterwards. While the artists were getting generous royalties and accolades from Marvel, they still felt like they were just hired. There was a higher share, along with a larger feeling of being treated just as hired help. Rob then called Todd McFarlane, who loved the idea so much he came out of retirement. However, he quickly took over, as his idea was not just to do creator-owned books while working at Marvel, but to break from Marvel altogether and to form their own company. Todd McFarlane knew that there would be strength in numbers. He had previously tried to start a union for comic book artists but failed, and if they were to leave Marvel and form their own company. While the combined talent of Liefeld, Larsen, Valentino, and McFarlane was good, another big name or two would be perfect, particularly Jim Lee, the artist of Marvel's highest-selling book, The X-Men. They tried to recruit him, but Lee was hesitant to do so, lucky his position at Marvel with the money he was making. However, after witnessing his art being auctioned off at Sotheby's auction without him even getting a cut, let alone permission, not only did Lee join them, but Mark Silvestri, the current artist in the Wolverine, did as well. With 6 of Marvel's top artists on board, Todd felt it was time to make their move, and it would shake the comic book industry. On December 17, 1991, Todd McFarlane, with his wife and child in tow, led Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld to meet Terry Stewart, the then president of Marvel, along with Tom DeFalco, who, according to Rob Liefeld, fell into the meeting when he was secretly listening in the other room to comical effect. They met in New York City where they spoke about their grievances. Stewart offered more royalties and creative control, but the artists still felt like they were just hired help. And though Stewart would later state he never felt they came to negotiate, just that the meeting was only a formality for them to leave. After speaking to Marvel, Todd and the crew then went across the street to D.C. the next day to explain that they were forming their own company as well, repeating the same grievances they gave to Marvel and warned D.C. they should heed the same warnings. The president of D.C. was surprised, as at first he believed they were coming to sign on at the company, and he tried to counter that D.C. had recently enacted a royalty plan for their artist. Todd McFarlane countered with asking if any of the artists themselves had any input in how this plan was put together, which the president said no to. That was all McFarlane needed to hear, and he and the rest of the artists left to form their new comic book company. The new company was formed on February 1st, 1992 at Mark Silvestri's home, where Ross Porticio also joined up, bringing the founding artists to 7, though Porticio was never made a partner like the original 6. The first thing was to come up with a name, which was inspired by Andre Agassi ad that Todd McFarlane saw on TV, in which he said, "Image is everything." Todd loved it, and he said that was the name, Image Comics. The 6 original partners were Jim Lee, Todd McFarlane, Rob Liefeld, Jim Valentino, Mark Silvestri, and Erik Larsen. While Porticio also joined with Jim Lee, he would never, of course, be made partner. Another brief addition was the legendary Uncanny X-Men writer Chris Claremont, who wanted to work with Porticio on his series, The Huntsman, but Porticio decided to do his own work on Wetworks instead. The Huntsman would later appear in Jim Lee's Wildcats. Considering the number of X-Men and X-Force artists coming aboard, from Lee to Claremont to Liefeld and Silvestri, the break from Marvel was jokingly called the Exodus. The new company signed a 1-year distribution deal with Malibu, who got 10% of the profits, while the artists kept their other 90% for themselves from their own books, with the minor set of fees set aside for Image Central to cover the administration and traffic duties for the books. Malibu also benefited from the publicity of the publishing Image, along with advertising their books in the comics as well as part of the deal, which included their new superhero line, the Ultraverse. However, the Image founders started to resent the deal, especially with having to advertise Image Malibu's books and theirs, so they set up their own network to keep all the profits, making a clean break from Malibu after the contract was up. One of the first rules of Image was that the company only owned two things, the name and the logo. Everything else was to be creator-owned, as it was meant to be a company where creators could bring their work, owning it without editorial interference. In addition, creators could leave the company whenever they wanted to and take their work with them. With these incentives, other top-flight artists were offered places at Image as well, such as Dale Keown, the current artist in The Incredible Hulk, Larry Stroman from The X Factor, and Sam Keefe from DC's Sandman. This was all part of a larger strategy as Image, as they knew the more talented artists at the company, the more legitimacy they would have. The founding of Image became a media event that February as well, with nearly every major newspaper and TV outlet covering it. It also caused Marvel's stock to drop $11.37 a share to $54.62 on February 17th. Marvel's reaction to the artists did vary as well, based on their level of success. For example, Lee and Silvestri were allowed to finish their runs in their respective comics. Silvestri's last issue will be Wolverine number 57. But Valentino and Keown were promptly fired. McFarlane argued for a clean break, as Rob Liefeld originally thought he could still work on X-Force at Marvel while doing his Youngblood comic book. However, McFarlane correctly pointed out that they could barely produce one book on their own, let alone two, so they should focus on their own creator-owned Image books. Liefeld, meanwhile, appeared on the Dennis Miller Show due to his popularity along with Image in general. When they set out, they originally thought they would need 60,000 in sales, but hoped for 100,000 just to make what they were making at Marvel. Instead, they were about to blow theirs and the world's expectations completely apart. On April 16, 1992, Image Comics launched when Youngblood number 1 was released by Rob Liefeld, selling 325,000 copies on its first printing, and that was just getting started. By the last printing of Youngblood number 1, it has sold over 1 million copies, selling out faster than retailers could keep them in stock. Youngblood became the highest-selling independent book of all time, at least at that point, though despite its criminal drubbing for its poor lighting and art structure, something Rob Liefeld himself concedes years later. Despite this, the Image era had begun, and it was just getting started. Youngblood's success would soon be followed by Todd McFarlane's Spawn, Eric Larsen's Savage Dragon, and Jim Lee's Wildcats, all which went on to pass the 1 million mark in sales, with Spawn replacing Youngblood as the highest-selling independent comic of all time at 1.7 million copies sold. The rest of the founders soon followed, with Mark Silvestri's Cyberforce, which sold 850,000, and Jim Valentino's Shadowhawk. The one hiccup was Ross Patricio's Wetworks, which was delayed due to the death of his sister and didn't see publication in 1994. Nevertheless, every Image creator was enjoying unprecedented success with the launch, with practically every book selling at least 500,000 copies. The sales were so high that in 1992, Image Comics actually surpassed DC in sales, becoming the number 2 publisher in America after Marvel. The gamble had paid off and then some. The founders and the artists who joined Image to leave the big two and set on their own and met with an enormous success. However, the realities of actually running a comic book business over being just an artist was about to catch up to them. It wasn't just the stories, though, as Image made a conscious effort to improve the production value of their comics to justify the then outrageous $1.95 price tag for each book. Those were the days. Eventually, they graduated to high-quality paper, beginning with Youngblood number 4 and Spawn number 8, along with hiring Steve Olif's Olympic Studios to colorize the books with a new computerized coloring. Olaf previously did this for Marvel, colorizing the classic manga Akira for American audiences. Like all manga, it was originally in black and white, making it the first comic colorized by a computer. Side note, Marvel never finished its translation of Akira, and it would be Dark Horse over a decade later who would finally translate and release the full series in America, but in its original black and white. Back to Image, Olaf's colorization was so well received, Todd McFarlane gave them a bonus check in thousands of dollars, prompting Olaf and Olympics to make Image their top priority. Soon, Olympics was colorizing 7% of Image's books, though it did lead to further comments that all of Image's comics looked alike. By 1993, the company was selling well, they was plagued by late shipments. And while their books were also criticized for the content and exploiting markets with the gimmicks. Shadowhawk in particular was infamous for doing mini comic books as foul covers and die card covers to make extra sales. To help get the late shipments under